The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension. The judge's gavel slammed down with such force that the entire room trembled, sending a ripple through the spectators. Gasps echoed as the truth, raw and unforgiving, spilled from the witness stand. The words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. A juror's knuckles whitened around the armrest as they gripped it, unwilling to look away. On the floor, a coffee cup shattered, its contents spreading like an ink stain, blurring the line between reality and the chaos unfolding. The weight of the revelation was palpable, each breath thick with anticipation. The stakes were high, lives teetering on the edge of ruin. The truth had arrived, and it was impossible to ignore. The game had changed, and there was no going back. Each side braced for the storm that was about to follow. The weight of the revelation settled over the room like a storm cloud, its dark presence making the air thick with uncertainty. The prosecutor's eyes narrowed, already formulating the next step, while the defense remained eerily calm. The jury exchanged glances, trying to process what they had just heard. One juror, unable to mask his emotions, turned slightly toward the person next to him, his whispered words barely audible. "Did she just say that?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, as every spectator seemed to hold their breath. The defendant's face remained unreadable, but his clenched fists betrayed a simmering anger. Behind him, his defense attorney leaned in, whispering something inaudible, trying to steady his client's nerves. The silence that followed the confession felt like an eternity. The courtroom's atmosphere was thick with tension as the defense continued to play its hand. The prosecutor's confidence was unshaken, but there was something in the defendant's eyes, a flicker of doubt. The defense lawyer, a seasoned veteran, kept his gaze sharp, never allowing his focus to waver. His voice was low, yet each word seemed to resonate through the room. His hand, resting on the table, gripped it harder with each question posed by the prosecutor. The jury, now caught between the two sides, exchanged wary glances, trying to make sense of the unfolding drama. The witness on the stand, a middle-aged man in his 50s, shifted uncomfortably as the defense attorney circled, asking questions that seemed innocuous at first, but carried heavy implications. The clock ticked, each second dragging out the growing uncertainty in the room. The truth seemed farther away than ever. The tension was palpable as the defendant's past slowly began to unravel under the harsh spotlight of the prosecution's questions. Every word from the prosecutor seemed like a calculated blow. The defense remained composed, yet behind his professional facade, the defense attorney was growing increasingly concerned. A slip-up could turn the tide of the case. In the stands, family members exchanged glances, their faces reflecting a mixture of disbelief and fear. The defendant's ex-wife, sitting just a few rows behind, clenched her fists tightly, her expression unreadable. She had her own secrets, and they were about to come to light. As the witness took the stand, the courtroom fell into a hushed silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on every person present. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, watched carefully, making no move to interrupt. The game was afoot. As the witness took the stand, the room seemed to hold its breath. His testimony was critical, but something in his demeanor seemed off. The defense attorney's eyes narrowed, watching for any signs of hesitation. The prosecutor, who had been prepared for this moment, didn't let up. He pressed harder, each question a deliberate strike. The defense attorney leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together, ready to counter any misstep. The jurors sat frozen, their eyes glued to the witness, hoping for some hint that could turn the tide. The tension built as the witness began to falter, his answers becoming more hesitant. The air in the room grew thick with suspicion. Was this man telling the truth? Or was he hiding something? The clock ticked, and the momentum of the case began to shift. Something was about to break. The tension in the courtroom had only grown. The prosecutor's relentless questioning was like a slow burn, each word cutting deeper. The defendant, once calm, now shifted in his seat, his nerves becoming more apparent. The defense attorney, always composed, stole a glance at his client, whose expression had begun to show cracks. The weight of the accusations was becoming too much. His mind raced, trying to hold on to a thread of hope as the evidence stacked against him. Every part of him screamed to fight back, but the room felt like it was closing in. The walls of the courtroom seemed to get tighter, the air thicker with every passing moment. The jury was watching closely, and it was clear that their judgment was starting to shift. The defendant's heart raced, and for the first time, he questioned whether he could trust his lawyer. His eyes darted around the room, seeking some form of reassurance, but there was none to be found. A sudden shift occurred in the room as the defense attorney stood up, his voice steady but commanding. "Your Honor, I request that this witness testimony be reconsidered." His words echoed in the silence. The judge, a woman in her 60s, adjusted her glasses, clearly surprised by the sudden motion. The prosecutor, who had been so sure of his case, narrowed his eyes. This unexpected move had caught him off guard. The jury shifted in their seats, sensing a change in the air. The defense attorney turned toward his client, giving him a brief, almost imperceptible nod. It was a small gesture, but it communicated everything. The fight wasn't over yet. The defendant, still shaken, clung to that small spark of hope. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep this act up, but he had to believe that they could win. The courtroom settled into a tense silence as the judge deliberated. The defense attorney remained standing, his back straight, as though bracing for whatever would come next. He knew the odds were stacked against them, but he refused to show weakness. The prosecutor, however, was already looking ahead, confident that the judge would rule in his favor. He was already calculating his next move. The defendant, meanwhile, felt his chest tighten. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. His mind raced, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were slipping away. He glanced at his attorney, searching for some reassurance. The defense attorney's eyes met his for a brief moment. No words were exchanged, but it was clear that both men were fully aware of what was at stake. The judge's voice broke the silence, and the fate of the trial would soon be decided. The judge's decision came down swiftly, and the courtroom reacted in an instant. A ripple of whispers filled the room as the defense attorney quickly sat back down. The defendant felt his stomach drop. The ruling was not in their favor. The prosecutor, clearly pleased with the result, gave a small, satisfied nod. The defense attorney, however, remained calm, his expression unreadable. The defendant turned his head to look at his lawyer, his eyes filled with confusion and fear. "What now?" he mouthed silently. The defense attorney leaned over and whispered, "Trust me." But even as he said the words, the doubt in his own eyes was unmistakable. There was a plan, but for the first time, the defense attorney wasn't entirely sure it would work. As the tension continued to build, the defense attorney stood once more, his voice cutting through the murmur of the courtroom. "Your Honor, we request an immediate recess." The request hung in the air, and for a brief moment, there was a sense of disbelief. The judge glanced at the clock, then at the defense attorney, before giving a small nod. The gavel struck, and the courtroom erupted into a flurry of movement as the judge's decision to grant a break sent everyone scattering. The defense attorney turned to his client and whispered, "We have a chance to regroup. This isn't over." The defendant, still shaken, nodded, trying to find his center amidst the chaos. For the first time since the trial began, he allowed himself to breathe, if only for a moment. The courtroom was buzzing with tension as a new witness took the stand. His testimony contradicted everything that had come before. The defense attorney, whose calm demeanor had been his strength, now looked uneasy. This was not the break they needed. The prosecutor, a seasoned tactician, leaned in slightly, watching the defendant with a smirk of victory. The jurors, once so focused, exchanged uncertain glances. Doubts crept into their minds. The defendant's face was a mask of disbelief, but his eyes darted toward his lawyer, silently begging for guidance. The defense attorney shifted in his seat, analyzing the witness words, mentally calculating how to dismantle the testimony. The pressure was mounting, but the defense knew they couldn't afford a slip. Every word from this witness carried the potential to shatter their case. Silence settled over the room, and every eye was on the witness, waiting for the next bombshell. The defense attorney sprang into action, immediately objecting to the witness' claims. "Objection, Your Honor. The witness' testimony is based on hearsay and is irrelevant to the case." His voice was firm, but his hand shook slightly as he raised it. The judge, a woman in her 60s, looked over her glasses, her expression unreadable. The prosecutor argued back, pointing out the relevance of the testimony. The defendant, barely able to keep his composure, clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. His lawyer's words hung in the air, and the room held its collective breath. The jury's attention was now split between the two sides, their faces a mixture of confusion and anticipation. The defense had a chance to strike back, but would it be enough? Time seemed to slow as the judge deliberated on the objection. The outcome would determine the next move in this high-stakes game. The judge finally ruled in favor of the prosecution, and the defense attorney's heart sank. He had hoped for more, but this was a setback. The witness continued his testimony, each word further entangling the defendant in a web of lies. The defense lawyer's mind raced as he tried to regroup, his gaze fixed on the prosecutor. The prosecutor, now emboldened, delivered his next line of questioning with sharp precision, each question designed to poke holes in the defendant's story. The jury, already unsure, began to shift in their seats, their expressions more skeptical. The defendant, overwhelmed, leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his head in his hands. The defense attorney briefly placed a hand on his shoulder, an unspoken gesture of reassurance. The fight was far from over, but it felt like every step they took led them deeper into the shadows. The defense attorney, though momentarily rattled, quickly recovered. "Your Honor, we request that this witness' credibility be examined under closer scrutiny," he said, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. The judge considered the request, her eyes scanning the witness' face for any signs of dishonesty. The prosecutor, unwilling to concede even an inch, shook his head dismissively. The defense lawyer, however, was relentless. He needed to find a crack, any weakness that would allow him to turn the tide. The witness, growing more nervous, stammered slightly as he answered the next question. The defense attorney pounced on this opening, pressing him for details that would expose the inconsistencies in his story. Every word felt like a battle. The defendant, still reeling from the witness testimony, couldn't look away. Could his lawyer still salvage this? The witness faltered under pressure, and the defense attorney knew this was his moment. "So you're telling the court that you were in two places at once?" The witness' face betrayed him, he stammered, clearly flustered. The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath as the prosecutor, looking frustrated, quickly interjected. The defense lawyer pressed on relentlessly, until the witness' story started to crumble. The jurors, who had been teetering between belief and doubt, now shifted in their seats, more skeptical than ever. The defendant, for the first time in what felt like days, allowed himself to relax slightly. There was still hope. The defense attorney, sensing a victory, turned toward the jury, his eyes scanning their faces. He knew that the scales were tipping, but the battle was far from over. The fight had only just begun. The courtroom was thick with suspense as the defense lawyer called his next witness. The door creaked open, and in walked a figure that no one expected. A former employee of the defendant's company. His name was Richard Hayes, a 40-year-old man with a stern face. He had once been the defendant's closest confidant, and yet, here he was summoned by the defense. The prosecutor immediately stood, his face betraying a mix of shock and concern. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady but clearly rattled. "This witness has no place in this trial." But the defense attorney pressed on, insisting that Richard Hayes had crucial information that could change everything. The room fell silent as Richard stepped to the stand, his eyes scanning the room, his demeanor calm but serious. Every eye in the courtroom was on him as he prepared to speak. Richard's voice was steady as he began to speak, recounting his years working for the defendant. "I was in charge of the finances," he said. "I had access to everything. And what I found..." He paused, clearly weighing the gravity of his next words. "What I found was a forged document, a will that wasn't signed by the deceased. The gasp from the audience was audible, and the prosecutor quickly rose to his feet. "Objection!" he shouted, but it was too late. The damage was done. The defendant's face paled, his breathing shallow. The defense attorney remained composed, nodding for Richard to continue. The truth was out, but it was only the beginning. The jury's expressions were unreadable, but the tension in the room had escalated to an almost unbearable level. What had once seemed like a straightforward case was now anything but. The prosecutor demanded that the witness be discredited, but Richard Hayes' testimony had already taken hold. "If what you say is true," the prosecutor sneered, "then why didn't you come forward sooner?" Richard's eyes narrowed. "Because I was threatened," he replied, his voice steady but tinged with anger. "But now I'm here to tell the truth." The defense attorney leaned in, listening intently, a faint smile crossing his lips as the prosecutor fumbled for a response. This was the break they had been waiting for. The tension in the room was thick as Richard continued to explain how he had been forced into silence for fear of his own safety. But now, with the pressure mounting, he had no choice but to speak. The jury was watching, their eyes fixed on Richard as the room waited for the next revelation. The weight of the revelation settled heavily in the room, but it wasn't enough. The defense attorney knew that more had to be said to convince the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice calm yet firm, "the truth is out. This forged will changes everything." The prosecutor's face twisted with anger, but the defense attorney pressed on. "The prosecution would have you believe that this man is guilty, but it's not the truth. The truth is that the deceased's will was tampered with, and the only person with the motive to do so." He trailed off, letting the words hang in the air. The defendant, still pale, watched the defense attorney with a mixture of gratitude and hope. For the first time in days, he felt like the scales were tipping in his favor. The jury, however, was still silent. Their decision was far from certain. The room remained silent as the defense attorney concluded his argument. "This is the truth. A forged will. A calculated move to destroy an innocent man's life." The jury was no longer passive. They were on the edge of their seats, each person processing the impact of what had just been revealed. The judge, a 60-year-old woman, looked over her glasses, her expression stern but thoughtful. The prosecutor, now visibly rattled, began to formulate a counterattack, but he was losing ground. The defense attorney had planted the seed of doubt, and it was now up to the jury to decide whether it would grow. The defendant, still reeling from the intensity of the moment, stood up slowly, his mind racing. Could they win? Would this be enough to clear his name? As the tension in the room built to a crescendo, the gavel was raised. The verdict was drawing near. The courtroom was more intense than ever. The closing arguments were upon them, and the defense attorney had one last chance to sway the jury. His voice was calm, but his words were sharp. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what we've uncovered is the truth, plain and simple. The prosecution would have you believe that my client is guilty of a crime he did not commit, but we have shown you evidence to the contrary." Richard Hayes' testimony exposed the forgery, the motive, and the lies that have kept an innocent man in the dark for far too long. "It's time for you to look at the facts and not be swayed by distractions. My client stands." The words echoed in the courtroom as the jury sat in silence. The defendant's heart raced, his fate hanging in the balance. This was it. This was the moment that would decide everything. The prosecutor rose to make his final argument, his face a mask of anger. "The defense has given you a story, a web of lies and distractions," he said, his voice booming in the quiet room. "Well, what the defense does not want you to see is the truth. The defendant had the opportunity, the motive and the means. He's tried to confuse you with claims of forgery and deceit, but the facts are clear. This is a simple case. A man took the life of another for his own benefit. That's the truth, and no amount of clever words can change that." His gaze flicked to the defendant, and for a moment, there was an almost palpable tension between them. The jury sat still, watching, waiting for the verdict to come. But in that moment, the defendant could only think of one thing. Was it enough? Could they really win? The room was still as the judge prepared to give her instructions. "You have heard the arguments, you have seen the evidence, and now it is time for you to decide," she said, her voice steady and authoritative. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with the weight of their meaning. The jury looked up at her, their faces unreadable. The defense attorney, though outwardly calm, felt his pulse quicken. This was it, the final moment. The jury would soon deliberate, and then the decision would be made. The defendant sat in his seat, his face pale, but his hands steady. He had fought with everything he had. He had told the truth, and now all he could do was wait. The seconds felt like hours as the courtroom held its breath. The courtroom had emptied, and the jury had gone to deliberate. The defense attorney and the defendant stood together in the empty room, the silence between them palpable. "I did everything I could," the defense attorney said, his voice low but steady. "The rest is in their hands now." The defendant nodded, though his face was still filled with uncertainty. "But what if they don't believe me?" he asked, his voice shaking slightly. The defense attorney placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You told the truth. That's all anyone can do. We've given them the evidence. Now we wait." The defendant nodded again, trying to find comfort in his lawyer's words. But as he looked out at the empty courtroom, the fear of the unknown gripped him. The next few hours would determine his fate. The jury had returned. The silence in the courtroom was deafening as everyone waited for the verdict. The judge's voice broke the stillness. "We have reached a decision," she said, her voice echoing through the room. The defendant's heart was pounding in his chest as he stood, his hands trembling. The defense attorney stood by his side, his face calm but his eyes betraying his anxiety. The jury foreman stood and read the verdict. "Woo, the jury, find the defendant not guilty." The words rang out like a bell, and the weight of them seemed to lift from the defendant's shoulders. He felt the air rush into his lungs for the first time in what felt like forever. The defense attorney turned to him, a small, satisfied smile crossing his face. "You're free." The days after the trial were both a relief and a torment for the defendant. He had been found not guilty, but the truth still lingered. His life, once shattered by the accusations, was now in pieces. He sat alone in his apartment, staring out the window as the city bustled below. He had won, but at what cost? The media had descended on him, the scandal still fresh in the minds of everyone who had followed the case. Though free from the court's grip, the weight of the trial remained. His attorney had told him to move on, to live his life, but every corner of his existence felt tainted. He had been granted freedom, but it wasn't the same. His relationships were broken, his reputation damaged, and the hardest part was yet to come: forgiving himself. The freedom he had won felt empty, a hollow victory. The next morning, the defendant met with his defense attorney in a small cafe. There was no fanfare this time, no victory speeches. Just the two of them, sitting in silence over cups of coffee. "How do you feel?" the defense attorney asked, his tone gentle. The defendant hesitated, staring into his cup. "I don't know," he finally said. "It's like I'm free, but not really." The attorney nodded, understanding. "It's not just the law that needs mending," he said quietly. "You'll need time to heal, to rebuild what was broken." The defendant sighed. "I don't know where to start." "Start with yourself," the attorney replied. "You can't fix everything all at once, but you can begin by finding peace within." The defendant looked at his attorney, silently grateful for the advice but unsure of how to move forward. He had won, but the journey ahead felt just as daunting. The defendant walked through the city streets, trying to get lost in the crowd. But everywhere he went, there were reminders, the looks from strangers, the hushed whispers. He wasn't sure if they knew his face from the trial, or if it was just the paranoia of someone who had been in the public eye. His life had changed irrevocably. People knew him now, but for all the wrong reasons. He felt the weight of every gaze. He passed by a newsstand with his picture on the cover of a tabloid. It was a snapshot from the trial, his face twisted in anxiety. He couldn't avoid it. The past was now a permanent part of him. He wanted to scream, to tear down the life he had once known and build a new one. But it wasn't that simple. The world had moved on, but he was stuck in the shadow of what had happened. Weeks passed and life began to settle into a new rhythm. The defendant, though still haunted by the past, had started to rebuild his relationships. His ex-wife, who had watched the trial unfold, came to him one evening. The conversation was tentative at first, awkward even, but as they spoke, the barriers between them began to fade. "I don't know how to make this right," the defendant said quietly. "I don't even know where to start." She looked at him, her eyes softening. "I don't have all the answers either," she said, "but I'm willing to try." The two of them sat together, the silence between them comfortable now, not strained. For the first time in a long while, the defendant felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things could be fixed. The road ahead was long, but he wasn't alone anymore. The defendant stood at the edge of the pier, the ocean stretching out before him. The city's skyline was faint in the distance, a reminder of everything he had been through. He took a deep breath, feeling the cool breeze against his face. He had been through hell, but now, standing here, he felt a sense of peace. The court case was behind him, but it would always be a part of him. There was no denying that. But the future, his future, was still unwritten. For the first time, he was no longer afraid of what lay ahead. He didn't know where his journey would take him, but he was ready to take that first step. As he turned to leave the pier, he knew that it was time to move forward. The past had shaped him, but it wouldn't define him. He had a second chance, and this time, he wouldn't let it slip away. The day had come to a close, and the courtroom was empty. The defendant sat alone in his chair, looking at the blank walls. His trial was over, but his life was still unfolding, one uncertain step at a time. He had been acquitted, but he couldn't shake the weight of everything that had happened. He had lost so much: trust, friendships, and peace of mind. Yet he had gained something too: his freedom. His future was still uncertain, but at least he could shape it now. He had been through the fire, and he had come out on the other side. But what now? The journey wasn't over. He would rebuild, but the scars would remain. They always did. He glanced out of the courtroom window, the city sprawling out before him. It was late, but the streets still buzzed with life. People were moving on just as he would, even if it meant starting from scratch. The defendant stepped out of the courthouse, greeted by the cool night air. The streets were full of people, unaware of his struggle. He walked aimlessly, feeling detached from it all. He had been the center of attention, the object of scandal, but now he was just another person in the crowd. His lawyer had told him that things would get better with time. But could they? His heart was heavy, burdened by the weight of all the lies, the manipulation. No matter how many apologies or reconciliations he made, the past would never fully fade. He reached a park bench and sat down, staring into the distance. Was freedom really freedom if the past still controlled him? The answer, he realized, was something only time would reveal. The defendant's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from his ex-wife. "We need to talk." His heart sank. He had hoped they could move on, but this felt like an unfinished chapter, one that needed closure. He knew he couldn't avoid it any longer. He stood, taking a deep breath as if preparing for a storm. The last few months had been filled with tension, but this moment, this meeting, could change everything. He didn't know what she wanted to say, but he was afraid of hearing the truth. He had been a part of her life, just as she had been a part of his. But after everything that had happened, could they ever truly heal? He walked toward the street corner, unsure of what awaited him. But he had no choice now. It was time to face the past. They met at a small cafe, the same one where they had shared many conversations in the past. She was already there, waiting, her eyes tired but calm. The defendant sat down across from her, unsure of how to begin. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "for everything." She nodded, her expression unreadable. "I know," she replied. "We both have our faults." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and unresolved. The defendant wanted to say more, to explain everything, but he realized there was nothing left to explain. The damage had been done. "Where do we go from here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She took a deep breath. "We start with forgiveness," she said softly. The defendant nodded, the weight lifting slightly from his chest. It wouldn't be easy, but for the first time he believed in the possibility of healing. The conversation ended with no final answers, but somehow it felt like a step toward resolution. The defendant left the cafe, the streets no longer feeling as cold as before. The city around him was alive, but for the first time, he felt a sense of peace. His past wasn't gone. It would never be, but it no longer controlled him. He could finally breathe. He had faced the darkness, confronted the people he had hurt, and now he could begin to rebuild. There were no guarantees, no promises, but there was hope. The future was still uncertain, but at least it was his to shape. As he walked into the night, the weight on his shoulders lifted, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel alone. The past had taught him many things, but it had also shown him one undeniable truth. It was never too late to start again.